1945, 3 Native American sisters vanished without a trace from a government-run boarding school in the U.S. Their absence was barely noticed in the chaos of the post-war era by everyone except their older brother. He never stopped looking. And 40 years later, he uncovered something chilling, something that shattered the silence and exposed what had long been buried beneath the surface of American history. The wind dragged dust across the empty land of Whispering Rock, New Mexico, where 58-year-old Thomas Red Elk sat outside his aging 1971 camper. It was 1985. After 4 decades on the road chasing shadows, he'd come to rest here, worn down, alone, and holding on to memories the world had tried to erase. His real name was Ashki Yaji, but like so many children taken by the system, the boarding school renamed him. Tommy, they had called him. He smoothed an old newspaper across his lap, handling it like a fragile artifact. The headline declared, "Indian Boarding Schools, Shaping a Bright American Future." Beneath it, a photograph that had haunted him for most of his life. 3 little girls, seated on the steps of a wooden chapel, their hair tightly braided, their white dresses spotless for the camera. Behind them stood a man in black robes holding a Bible, the priest. Thomas knew every detail in that picture. The way Sarah's hands were gently folded, the way Naomi's shoulder slumped slightly from an old injury, the way little Eva looked so serious, like she'd aged beyond her years. But those weren't their real names. The school had taken those too. Sarah had been born Nazi, meaning she moves with the waters, chosen by their grandmother during the spring floods. Naomi had been Alisi, she is cherished, and Eva was Eileen, joy. They were his baby sisters, taken from their home in Cottonwood Bluffs when officials showed up with paperwork, promises, and lies. Thomas took a long drink from a dusty bottle, hoping the sharpness would dull the memories. He was 14 when the agents arrived. His father had been arrested for resisting the forced seizure of their ancestral land. Their mother had died during Eileen's birth. The government labeled them wards of the state, as if that meant anything besides being stripped of everything. St. Gertrude's wasn't a school. It was a place where culture was erased. Boys and girls were separated, language was forbidden, and speaking in Dene meant punishment, harsh punishment, a locked basement, hidden bruises, silence. But the worst day came in 1945. He was 18. The war was ending, but cruelty toward Native families was far from over. The school had been preparing for a press visit. Thomas remembered it clearly. They lined up the children like mannequins, the youngest ones placed in front to draw sympathy from the camera lenses. His sisters were selected specifically for their fragile appearance, what the priest called purity. What the reporters saw as thankfulness was really fear. That photo, the one he still carried, was taken that day. And the next morning, they were gone. They didn't show up for morning prayers or evening devotions, and then dread set in. Thomas begged the staff for answers. Instead, they gave him fists and silence, locked him in the dark for 3 days, told him to forget he ever had sisters. But forgetting was never an option. The beatings didn't break him. He ran. At 18, he was legally an adult, so no one looked for him too hard. No flyers, no police. Just another Native boy gone, and no one cared enough to ask why. For 40 years, Thomas searched. He lived out of that camper, worked odd jobs when he could, showed that same photo to anyone who'd listen. He never stopped hoping, until he did. Whispering Rock had been his last stop, not because he found closure, but because he ran out of strength. This quiet town felt like the right place to wait for things to end, a place that was just as forgotten as he felt. The empty bottle gave a hollow clink as Thomas tilted it back for the last drop. He muttered under his breath, folded the old newspaper with the same care he always did, and placed it gently on the passenger seat, its permanent home. His hands didn't shake as much when he'd had a drink. The memories blurred just enough around the edges to let him breathe. Sliding behind the wheel, he turned the key. The camper's engine sputtered, coughed, then rumbled to life like an old man trying to clear his throat. The liquor store was 10 minutes away, the only one left in Whispering Rock, and like always, Marta would be working the counter. The door's little bell jingled as he walked in. Marta Dane looked up and offered him a smile that felt genuine. She was in her 60s now, her silver hair tied neatly, her eyes soft with the kind of understanding that only comes from weathering life's rougher storms. "Tommy," she greeted warmly, her voice gently marked by a Spanish accent. "Let me guess. Ran out again?" He gave her a tired smile. Marta was one of the rare people in town who didn't treat him like a burden. Over the years, their friendship had quietly grown, built on small talk and quiet respect. "You know me too well," Tommy said, heading toward the cooler in the back. He grabbed a six-pack, the cheapest one, and walked back to the counter. But as he reached into his pocket, his heart sank. Crumpled bills. Not nearly enough. He'd forgotten how much gas had cost him last week. His check wouldn't come for another 5 days. Marta watched him silently, her smile fading as he counted the money again. "You're not looking too good, Tommy," she said gently. "When's the last time you had something real to eat?" He shrugged, feeling the weight of it. Not just the hunger, but the shame. He hated how predictable it had become, how alcohol had become the center of his days. "Things are tight," he said quietly. "I'll come back when I've got it." But Marta leaned in, her fingers folding together on the counter. "Listen," she said, her tone soft but steady. "I've seen that newspaper you carry. I've seen what's behind your eyes. Maybe it's time for something different. Would you come with me to church this Sunday?" Tommy almost laughed. Church? After everything? He had grown up in a boarding school, memorizing verses and repeating prayers that were never meant to comfort him. Religion reminded him of what was taken, not what was given. And his connection to traditional Navajo teachings had faded years ago, lost somewhere between grief and disconnection. "That's not a place for someone like me," he said, voice low. "I don't think your God's looking for people like me." But Marta wasn't discouraged. Her eyes lit up with something steady and strong. "Tell you what," she said, "if you come to the full service with me, I'll cover these 6 bottles. And if you're still not convinced it helped, I'll throw in 2 more. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "So now church comes with a bonus round?" Marta laughed, a bright, unexpected sound. "Maybe it's not exactly by the book, but sometimes people need a reason to try something new. And sometimes faith starts with something as small as curiosity. 8 bottles for sitting through 1 church service? He had nowhere to be, nothing better to do. And Marta's honesty, it made it harder to say no. "Fine," he said at last. "But let's be clear. I'm going for the beer, not the blessings." Her smile widened. "That's more honest than most. It starts in 30 minutes. Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. Just follow the road toward the hills. Take a left at the wooden cross. Think you can stay dry for half an hour?" He almost asked for 1 bottle now, just something to take the edge off. But the look in her eyes made him pause. "Yeah, I'll manage." Back at the camper, Tommy searched for something decent to wear. His cleanest shirt was still stained and faded, but it would have to do. He poured some water from a jug over his face, combed through his gray hair with his fingers, and looked at himself, hollow-eyed but present. Driving through town toward the church, he couldn't help wondering what he was doing. The parish was a simple adobe building with a wooden cross on the front. Cars filled the gravel lot. Families stepped out in their Sunday best, heading toward the doors. He parked next to a spotless sedan, feeling every inch of rust on his old camper. But before the doubt could creep too far in, Marta was suddenly there beside him, smiling brightly, her arm gently wrapping around his. "Thanks for coming, Tommy," she said softly. "I think this is exactly where you're meant to be today." Inside, sunlight spilled through colored glass, casting soft hues across the worn wooden pews. The air was still, quiet, and for the first time in a long while, Tommy felt himself pause. Just pause. The church was simple but lovingly cared for. Whitewashed adobe walls, a wooden altar trimmed with fresh desert flowers. Tommy followed Marta to a pew near the back, quietly aware of the way his worn shirt clung to him, and the faint scent of beer that lingered no matter how much water he'd splashed on his face. He slouched into the wooden bench, arms crossed, just waiting for the service to be over, and his promised reward waiting back at the store. When the congregation stood for the opening hymn, Tommy stood too, muttering along to words that stirred vague memories from his childhood. When they sat, he sat. When they knelt, he didn't. A few nearby glances narrowed at his refusal, but he stared straight ahead, unfazed. The priest at the front, a man in his 50s, kind eyes beneath silver-streaked hair, stepped up to the altar. "That's Father Murphy," Marta whispered beside him. "He's been here for over a decade. Good man." Tommy nodded out of habit, but his attention drifted. Just off to the side of the altar, something unusual caught his eye. A quiet cluster of nuns, not part of the usual parish, stood silently in the shadows. He pointed subtly toward them, and Marta followed his gaze. "They're not from this church," she whispered, surprised. "Their habits are different, longer, and they usually don't stand up front like that. Something special must be happening today." The nuns stood still in black robes that swept the floor, their faces partially hidden by their head coverings. There was something solemn, even severe, about them, something that stirred uncomfortable memories in Tommy's chest. The robes reminded him too much of the past, and yet, their faces, their features, most of them looked like women from his own childhood, indigenous, familiar, grounding. His chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years. Father Murphy's sermon moved in and out of his thoughts like background music. Snippets about endurance, about how meaning often reveals itself slowly through pain. But Tommy's eyes kept returning to the nuns. There was something about the way they stood, still as stone, unmoving, almost otherworldly. Near the end of the service, Father Murphy's voice rose again, this time catching Tommy's full attention. "Before we finish today, I want to share something rare. The Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah are visiting us today. They're on their yearly pilgrimage across New Mexico, offering what they call quiet prayer healing. If anyone here feels they need peace, you're welcome to come forward after the service." Marta nudged Tommy gently. "You should go to them," she whispered. "It could be good for you." He shook his head. "I came. I sat through it. That was the deal." "Then let's get your beer," Marta said, starting toward the doors. But before they could leave, Father Murphy caught sight of them. He approached with a warm smile. "Marta, it's always a joy to see you. And who have you brought today?" She introduced Tommy, and the priest extended a hand with genuine welcome. "It's good to have you with us, Thomas. I don't think we've met before," Tommy replied before he could stop himself. "Been a while. I used to go a long time ago, back when I was a kid. Learned all the verses in a place I'd rather forget." There was something about the way he said it, something unspoken in his tone, that made Father Murphy linger. Maybe it was the distant look in Tommy's eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly. Either way, the priest seemed to see someone quietly unraveling inside. As they talked, Tommy found himself revealing more than he intended. He spoke of the weight he carried, the days that blurred together, the fight to stay afloat. He didn't mention the sisters, not directly. That pain was still buried too deep, but the rest came out in pieces. When Tommy finished, Father Murphy nodded and gestured to the silent women near the altar. The Handmaid Sisters live in almost complete solitude, he explained. "They speak only to God. They've taken vows that keep them silent, devoted to a life of reflection. But once a year, they come out to offer this moment of grace." He motioned toward a table at the front. "You don't even need to speak. Just write what's in your heart, light a candle, and place it in their box. When they return to their monastery, they'll read the requests in prayer. A few weeks later, they send back written responses, messages they believe are guided." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "So they answer on God's behalf?" Father Murphy smiled. "That's the belief. Not everyone understands it, but some say the words that come back are exactly what they needed to hear." Marta nodded toward the table. "Why not try?" And for the first time in years, Tommy found himself moved by curiosity. He wasn't sure what he believed in anymore, if anything, but something about the quiet power of those women in black, it made him pause. Maybe, just maybe, he could ask about his sisters, about where they went, about whether anyone, still saw them. So he stepped forward, the sound of his boots soft on the tile floor. At the small table, he found a stack of forms and a pen. He wrote his name and, in shaking script, the question that had haunted him all his life. Then, guided by one of the silent nuns, he lit a candle. The flame flickered and held steady in the stillness. And for the first time in a long time, so did he. Tommy awkwardly made the sign of the cross, the motion feeling unfamiliar after so many years away from any kind of faith. Still, he stepped forward toward the prayer box, where 5 of the visiting sisters stood in quiet formation. Up close, he could see it clearly now. Most of them had features like his own. It stirred something conflicted deep inside. The sight reminded him too much of the past, of how children like him had once been forced to participate in ceremonies meant to erase their culture. But there was also something else, something he couldn't name, a familiarity that tugged at something half buried inside him. The box was nearly full. Tommy had to press his folded prayer form down to make it fit, and then something pulled at him. He looked up at the nun nearest the box, the one who had caught his attention earlier, and spoke quietly, more to the moment than to her. "If you're right about all this, if your God really speaks through you, then ask him where my 3 missing sisters are. If he tells you, I'll be the most devoted Catholic you've ever seen." He allowed himself the hint of a smile, hoping for a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding. But the sisters didn't react. Still, when he mentioned his sisters, he noticed something, a subtle change in their expressions. Not quite shock, but something like silent empathy. It was small, almost too small to name. But he felt it. As he turned to walk back toward Marta and Father Murphy, something made him glance back. The same nun, the one he'd spoken to, was lifting the heavy box to carry it toward a side room. Her steps were uneven. She walked with a limp, favoring her right leg. The weight of the box made her stumble slightly. She reached the door, opened it, and a gust of wind caught her habit, brushing it across her face. Just for a second, Tommy saw it. A thick raised scar along her left temple, and everything stopped. His breath caught. His chest tightened. Naomi had a scar in that exact spot. A scar she earned protecting little Eva from a brutal nun who had lashed out with a wooden ruler. Tommy hadn't even seen it happen. She had whispered the story to him after morning mass, voice trembling, trying to be brave. His mouth opened, ready to call her name, but the door closed softly before he could speak. He stood frozen, right there in the aisle, heart pounding, his world turning upside down. Was it really her? A second sister approached, gently gesturing for him to step aside. Others were waiting. Tommy mumbled an apology and made himself walk. His legs felt heavy, every step a struggle. Back at the altar, Marta and Father Murphy waited. Tommy reached them, dazed. "Sorry for the delay," he said, his voice uneven. I saw one of the sisters, limping. It just reminded me of something. The priest's face grew serious. Are you feeling all right? You look shaken. Tommy took a breath, as if preparing to dive into something deep. I need to tell you something, he said. I had 3 sisters. They've been missing for 40 years. Taken from me at a boarding school, St. Gertrude Indian School in Cottonwood Bluffs. Father Murphy's expression shifted, eyes widening. Taken? How? Tommy nodded slowly, the words spilling out now that the silence had finally broken. It was 1945. Reporters came to the school. They were doing a feature, showcasing how well the program worked. They took pictures. That same day, my sisters vanished. No one would say where they went. When I kept asking, they beat me, locked me up. He paused, then continued, his hands trembling slightly. I went back to that school years later. It's abandoned now, but the pain, it's still here. He tapped his chest softly. Still here every day. Father Murphy listened intently, saying nothing as Tommy continued. We were Navajo. My father was arrested when he resisted the seizure of our land. Then I was separated from my sisters. I've spent 4 decades looking for them. Nothing, no trace, until maybe today. The priest placed a steady hand on his shoulder, his voice low and compassionate. I can't imagine the weight you've carried, Thomas. What is it you're hoping to find now? Tommy swallowed hard. How do I let go of this? He asked. How do I stop feeling this anger, this grief? I drink to forget, but it never works. It always comes back. Father Murphy was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. Have you ever heard the story of Abraham? He asked. He waited a lifetime for a promise to be fulfilled. Decades went by. Still, he held on to faith, even when it made no sense. Sometimes the answers don't come when we want them to, but they come. He turned slightly, gesturing back toward the altar where the light still streamed through the stained glass. And sometimes, the answer isn't about finding something lost, but about healing what's still left. As Tommy stood near the front of the church, where he had just left his prayer request, Father Murphy placed a thoughtful hand on his shoulder. I truly believe you should wait and see what comes, the priest said. Many in our congregation have received messages from the handmaid sisters, messages that were strikingly personal, even transformative. Perhaps this is how God will finally speak to you about your sisters. For the first time in years, Tommy felt a flicker of hope, but questions quickly followed. Father, he asked cautiously, can you tell me more about these sisters? The handmaid sisters of St. Dinah. Who started their order? And why do so many of them seem to be indigenous? The priest's expression changed subtly. His tone became more guarded. The order was founded by Father Milford many years ago, he explained. His son now continues the work, but we aren't encouraged to discuss their origins in detail. Their mission is sacred, protected. Tommy pressed gently. And their monastery? Where is it? I'd like to learn more, maybe even visit. But Father Murphy shook his head firmly. I'm sorry, Thomas. I can't give you that information. The sisters live in seclusion. Their monastery is a private sanctuary where they follow a strict life of silence, modesty, and devotion. No visitors, no contact. The only time they appear publicly is during these church visits once a year. Tommy could tell there was more behind the priest's careful words, but it was clear the conversation had reached its limit. Marta, sensing the shift, stepped in with a soft smile. Well, Tommy, she said, a deal's a deal. Time for me to keep my promise. They said goodbye to Father Murphy and walked back through the shimmering afternoon heat toward their vehicles. I'll see you at the store, Marta said, sliding into her car. Tommy drove slowly through the dusty streets of Whispering Rock, his thoughts spinning. True to her word, Marta handed over 8 bottles of beer when he arrived at the store. "Try not to finish them all in one day," she said gently, giving him a knowing look. "And maybe next week we try church again?" Tommy gave a half smile, but his mind wasn't on the beer. It was still back at the church, on the scar, the limp, the face he couldn't stop thinking about. When he returned to his camper, something caught his eye. A piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. He pulled it out. A flyer. An announcement for the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dinah's annual church tour, listing their upcoming visits across New Mexico. Tommy folded the flyer without reading the details and cracked open a beer. As he started the camper's engine and rolled down the street, he passed Holy Martyrs one more time. That's when he saw them. The 5 nuns were emerging from the church, making their way toward a plain white van. A young church volunteer followed behind, carefully carrying several boxes, most likely filled with the prayer requests. Tommy watched as the van doors closed and the engine started. And just like that, they were leaving. He hesitated, then pulled out the flyer again, scanning for any address that might lead him to their monastery. Nothing, just vague instructions. Visit the next church. Submit a request. Wait for a reply. But Tommy didn't want to wait. His curiosity had become something more, a need to understand who these women were and why so many of them looked like they came from his world, his story, and maybe, just maybe, to find out if one of them truly was Naomi. So he made a decision. Instead of heading back to his usual parking spot, he followed the van. He stayed several lengths behind, careful not to draw attention. The road led them east, out toward the mountains. As the town faded in the rearview mirror, the terrain grew barren. Yellow grasses stretched toward the horizon. Faded fence posts stood like forgotten markers. Abandoned buildings crumbled in the distance. After nearly an hour of driving, Tommy finally saw it. A large compound rose from the empty land. Chain-link fencing surrounded the perimeter, but instead of barbed wire, fluttering prayer flags lined the top. A sturdy metal gate blocked the entrance, and a small guard post stood beside it. He pulled off the road and parked behind a clump of desert brush. From there, he watched. The white van rolled up to the gate. A young man stepped out of the guardhouse, native, serious, and alert. He surveyed the area before opening the gate and allowing the van inside. Tommy stayed hidden, heart pounding. This was not the monastery he had imagined. The compound looked worn, harsh, more like an institution than a place of prayer. There was nothing peaceful about it. The fencing, the guarded entrance, the silence. The gate clanged shut behind the van. For nearly half an hour, Tommy remained in the shade, watching. No movement beyond the fence, just still buildings and shadows under the desert sun. His beer sat untouched, warming in his hand as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. And slowly, the question that had haunted him for 4 decades returned stronger than ever. What if this place held the truth? The only movement around the compound came from the fluttering prayer flags, their faded colors snapping in the dry afternoon wind. As the silence dragged on, Tommy reached for something that had been with him through every town, every detour, every year. A small wooden cigar box tucked beside his makeshift bed. The lid creaked softly as he opened it. The box was worn smooth from decades of handling, its corners dulled, its finish faded. Inside were the few surviving pieces of a life the boarding school had tried to erase, fragments of identity too stubborn to be forgotten. He picked up the first item, a stack of old photographs. The edges were cracked, the paper brittle, but the images remained. Rows of children in identical uniforms, their faces vacant and stiff. But one photo stood apart, a quiet treasure. His sisters, sitting on the dormitory steps, caught in a candid moment. It had been taken by a kind kitchen worker who had slipped it to Tommy in secret. He had guarded it ever since. Beneath the photographs lay something even more precious, a piece of turquoise set in silver, worn smooth from years against his skin. It hung from a leather cord, darkened and softened with time. Tommy lifted it carefully, letting it rest in his hand. His father had made 4 of them, one for each child, during the winter before everything changed. The turquoise was a deep blue, webbed with darker veins like rivers etched into stone. He turned it over, running his thumb over the carved symbols on the back. His real name, Ashki Yaji, etched in the old Navajo script. His father had said the pendant would keep him grounded, would remind him who he was, no matter how far he was taken. Then, one final object remained in the box, a piece of scrap paper that looked like nothing but meant everything. An old school lunch menu. The front listed bland meals from long ago, but the back held something else entirely, a pencil sketch. He had drawn it himself, late at night in the dorms, alone, trying to hold on to what mattered. His sisters were captured there, from memory, Naomi gently braiding Eva's long hair while Sarah sang, her mouth open mid-note. It was a rare moment of warmth from a time when tenderness had been in short supply. Looking from the drawing to his memory of the woman at the church, the nun who had limped, the scar on her temple, his heart began to race. The eyes, the shape of her mouth, and that mark. It had to be Naomi. That scar had come from a terrible day, a day she'd thrown herself between a cruel nun and little Ava, shielding her from a ruler swung in fury. The wound had healed, but left behind a raised scar. It was the kind of mark you never forget. A low grinding sound broke his thoughts. The compound gate was opening. Tommy looked up to see a modest sedan pulling out. Through the open gate, he caught a brief, fragmented view of the courtyard inside. 2 women in black habits stood near the main building, locked in a quiet embrace. One of them was wiping her eyes. The other gently rubbed her back in comfort. Before Tommy could process what he was seeing, a third figure, someone in ordinary clothes, appeared and firmly ushered both women back toward the building. Then the gate shut behind them with a metallic finality. Tommy stared, unsettled. Why would women in a place of peace be crying? He wasn't imagining it. He'd barely touched his beer. The sedan disappeared down the dirt road, too far ahead to follow. Tommy's eyes drifted down to the pendant in his hand. Without another word, he slipped it over his neck and stepped out into the sun. The walk across the rough ground to the compound gate took several long minutes. As he approached, a young Navajo man emerged from the guard post. His posture was relaxed, but his hand rested firmly on a 2-way radio. "You can't be here," the guard said. His voice was calm, but final. "This is private land. No access." Tommy raised his hands in peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble, brother. I just want to know if this is where the handmaid sisters of St. Dinah live. I'm trying to find Father Milford too." The guard's expression shifted, sharp now. "Who are you? Why are you looking for him? His office isn't here. It's in Santa Rosa. This place, it's just for the sisters." Instead of answering, Tommy reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the turquoise pendant. It caught the light as it swayed in the dry breeze. The guard froze, his eyes locked onto the silver and stone. He recognized it instantly, not just the craftsmanship, but the meaning. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a prayer, a history, a name that had survived. For a moment, they stood in silence, 2 Navajo men, facing each other in the middle of the desert, knowing exactly what that pendant meant. Finally, the guard's voice softened. "I can't help you much," he said, eyes still fixed on the pendant. "Even though you're one of us. If you want real answers," the watchman finally said, his voice low but firm, "you'll need to speak with Father Milford II yourself. His office is in Santa Rosa. He pointed toward the distant mountain road. "Follow this route east, about 30 miles, but don't tell anyone I gave you that address." He cast a quick, nervous glance back toward the compound. "You need to go now," he added, his tone sharpening. "This isn't a safe place for someone like you to linger." Tommy hesitated, then turned back toward him. "Brother, are the sisters safe here?" he asked. "I saw some of them at church. Most of them looked like us, and today I saw them crying. Are they being protected in this place, or something else?" The guard's expression didn't move, but something flickered in his eyes. Something unmistakable. "We all have roles here," he said after a moment. "Mine is to keep my head down, and the people I care about safe." Then, more urgently, "Go, I've already said too much." Tommy gave a nod of gratitude and returned to his camper. The drive to Santa Rosa took him through winding mountain passes and dusty canyon trails. Red rock cliffs loomed high, the desert giving way to sparse pines as elevation rose. The sun still blazed fiercely overhead, but the air was cooler up here, thinner, sharper. As Tommy entered the outskirts of the town, something stirred in his chest. A strange familiarity. The buildings nestled against the cliffs, the shape of the land. It was all too familiar. When he passed a series of old road signs, his memory clicked into place. The signs still bore a faded name from long ago, Cielo Seco. He pulled over and stared at one of them, memories rushing back. He'd been here once, 2 decades ago, during the endless search for his sisters. He remembered a narrow canyon, a near fall into a deep ravine, and the stranger who had pulled him back from the edge. A botanist, maybe, or some kind of field researcher, out collecting samples. One of the few moments of human kindness he could still recall. Tommy let the memory pass. He had work to do. He checked his gas gauge, low. His wallet? Barely enough for fuel to get home. No money for maps, so he asked around. Storefronts. A bakery. A mechanic's shop. He mentioned the address quietly, cautiously. An hour passed before someone finally pointed him toward the right street. It was a quiet residential road on the edge of town, and there it was, the same plain sedan he had seen leaving the compound, parked outside a 1-story adobe home with a red tile roof. Not a church, not an office, just an ordinary house. Unremarkable, even forgettable. Tommy parked across the street, studying the vehicle. The interior was empty, but the hood still radiated heat. He took a breath, touched the turquoise pendant at his neck, and walked to the door. His plan was simple. Ask about the monastery. Ask about the indigenous women. Ask if anyone had heard of 3 sisters taken from St. Gertrude's in 1945. He knocked firmly, expecting footsteps, a pause, an answer. But instead, the door creaked open under his hand. "Hello?" he called, stepping cautiously into the shadowed threshold. "Father Milford? I'm here to ask about the sisters." Silence. Something felt wrong. The stillness wasn't peaceful. It was tense, unnatural. Tommy hesitated at the threshold, but instinct pushed him forward. He entered a modest living room, worn furniture, religious art, crosses, icons. But on the floor, streaks of dirt ran like tracks, long, uneven smears leading deeper into the house. He called again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" No answer. He followed the dirt trail down a hallway where faint red marks scratched the white walls, like fingernails had scraped for balance or escape. At the end of the hallway, a back door stood half open, revealing wild terrain beyond the house. Just beyond that, built into the rock itself, was a narrow staircase, stone steps descending into the earth. A wine cellar, he thought, or maybe a cold storage room, but then he heard it, a woman's voice, crying, pleading, the sharp crack of leather, unmistakable, and beneath it all, a man's voice, calm, steady, preaching. "The Lord shall cast down the wicked and bring ruin to the false idols. The tone wasn't holy. It was cold, controlled, devout in the most terrifying way. Tommy stood frozen at the top of the steps, his breath caught in his throat. Whatever this was, it wasn't prayer. Purifies the soul and casts out the corrupting spirits. The voice echoed from inside the stone, laced with fervor and menace. Tommy crept closer, each step measured, his pulse loud in his ears. At the mouth of the cave, flickering candlelight spilled onto the rough walls. Shadows danced violently. He could hear her cries now, raw, pleading. Each sob was followed by the unmistakable sound of something lashing through the air. Then, movement. A figure in religious robes appeared near the stone steps, slowly making their way upward. One glance was all Tommy needed. This wasn't sacred. This was something else entirely. Without a second thought, Tommy turned and ran, heart pounding, boots scraping through the dust as he moved through the house, out the front door, and back to his camper. His hands trembled as he started the engine. He had just seen something horrifying. He needed help, now. The police station in Santa Rosa was easy to spot, a squat brick building near the center of town with 2 patrol cars out front. Tommy pulled into the lot, took a breath, and stepped inside. The air smelled of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. 2 officers looked up from their desks as he entered, clearly unimpressed by the urgency on his face. "I need to report something," Tommy said, breathless. "There's a woman, maybe more, being hurt in a cellar. I heard it, screaming. At Father Milford II's house. You need to go, now." The older officer, a broad man with a sheriff's badge and a deeply lined face, squinted at Tommy. "Slow down, Chief. What's your name? And what exactly are you claiming happened?" Tommy explained everything as clearly as he could. The trail of dirt, the scratches on the wall, the cries, the voice. But with every sentence, the officers' faces shifted, from curiosity to disbelief. "You smell like alcohol," the sheriff interrupted, his tone turning sharp. "How much have you had today?" "Just 1 beer," Tommy said. "Hours ago. But that's not—" "You're saying this happened at Father Milford's place?" the younger officer asked. "Yes, I know it sounds—" The sheriff stood abruptly. "Listen to me. You're talking about Father Milford II. That man is a respected spiritual leader in this community. Been serving here for years. There's no way he's involved in what you're describing." Tommy's voice rose. "Please, just send someone to check. That house—" The sheriff's tone turned icy. "You're accusing a man of God, of abuse. You're admitting you walked into his home uninvited. That's trespassing. I could lock you up right now for making false statements." "I didn't break in. The door was open. I heard someone crying for help." But the sheriff was already moving to a wall shelf, pulling down a photo frame. He held it up. "This is Father Milford, the founder of the mission. Passed away 15 years ago." He raised another frame. "And this is his son, Father Milford II. He's the one who leads the faith here now." Tommy froze. His blood went cold. The man in the second photo, older now, gray at the temples, was unmistakable. He was the same priest who had stood behind his sisters in that photograph from the boarding school taken 40 years ago. Ever since Father Milford's revelation, the one that led us to rename this town from Silico to Santa Rosa, things have been different here, the sheriff said proudly. Lowest crime rate in the county. Peaceful. That man is a blessing. Tommy could see it clearly now. The town's law enforcement didn't just respect Father Milford II, they revered him. There would be no help here. "I'm giving you one warning," the sheriff said, voice hardening. "Leave town. Don't come back. If you make another accusation like this, you won't walk away from it. Get out of here, before I decide to arrest you for good." Shaking, Tommy left the station. His hands clenched the steering wheel as he sat in his camper, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He couldn't rely on the authorities. They were too close, too blinded. He needed someone outside the system, someone he could trust. Tommy drove to a nearby gas station and found a payphone. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a weathered address book, flipping through the pages with shaking fingers until he found the name, Clyde Yazy, the researcher, the man who had saved his life in these mountains 2 decades ago. He dropped a coin into the phone and dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, Yazy residence. Clyde, Tommy said. It's me, Thomas Red Elk. We met years ago, back near Silico. You pulled me out of that ravine. I need your help. I'm not sure if you remember me, Tommy said carefully. You were working in the mountains, collecting plant samples. I was the one who grabbed your arm before you fell into that canyon. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Tommy. Jesus, Clyde finally replied. Where are you calling from? Are you still out here? I'm in Santa Rosa, Tommy said. Didn't realize until today that it used to be Selseco. Clyde, I think I found something. I'm still looking for my sisters, and I may be closer than I've ever been. There's a Catholic priest, Father Milford the Sin. I heard something terrible. A woman being hurt in an underground room at his house. Clyde's voice was cautious. That's a heavy accusation, Tommy. Are you absolutely sure? I wish I wasn't, Tommy said, voice tight. But I am. I heard a woman crying, heard what sounded like whipping, and the priest, he was quoting scripture about punishing heathens. When I went to the police, they dismissed me like I was a drunk. They threatened to arrest me just for telling them. He paused, then added, 20 years ago, I saved your life. You told me that if I ever needed anything, I could call. Well, I'm calling it in. There was a long silence. Then Clyde answered. His tone changed completely. Where are you? At the Chevron on the main road through town. Stay there. I'll be there in 10. True to his word, Clyde pulled into the lot just minutes later. His pickup was dusty and weathered. He was older now, his face creased by years of sun, but Tommy recognized him instantly. Clyde stepped out and came straight to the payphone where Tommy waited. Tell me everything, he said, and Tommy did. He recounted the church service, the nun with the limp and the scar, the van he followed, the fenced-in compound, and finally what he'd seen and heard at Father Milford's home. As the story unfolded, Clyde's expression shifted from doubt to concern to something much darker. The local police won't lift a finger, Tommy finished. I saw his photo in the station. The same priest from that old newspaper, the one who stood behind my sisters the day they vanished. Clyde nodded grimly. You're right about the town. That man has deep roots here, but we have another path. If this involves tribal members, especially women, the Navajo Nation police can step in. My cousin Joe works for them, handles cross-jurisdiction cases. I'll call him now. Clyde headed inside the gas station to use the phone while Tommy waited, pacing restlessly. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, shadows stretching long across the desert floor. Every passing minute felt unbearable. Someone could still be down there, in that room. 15 minutes later, Clyde returned, his face set. Joe's on his way. He's bringing a team. When it comes to missing tribal citizens and religious institutions, they move fast. We'll meet them there, but we stay hidden until they make contact. They took Clyde's truck, less conspicuous than Tommy's camper, and retraced the road to Father Milford's house. Tommy's heart pounded the entire way. After 4 decades, the possibility of real answers now carried a weight almost too heavy to bear. They parked just out of sight, behind a stretch of low desert brush. From this vantage point, they could clearly see the house. The same sedan was still there, lights on. There, Clyde whispered, pointing toward the front yard. 2 men in white garments, simple, ceremonial robes, were carrying a limp figure toward the car. It was a woman, dressed in the black habit of the sisters. Her head rested awkwardly against one man's shoulder, and even from a distance, Tommy could see the stains. "Blood," he breathed. Her face was bruised, her nose, her cheeks, smeared with red. She looked barely conscious. The men were clearly struggling to hold her upright as they moved toward the vehicle. Before they could reach it, the sound of sirens split the silence. The two men froze. 3 vehicles came into view, 2 marked SUVs from the Navajo Nation Police and 1 unmarked lead vehicle. "That's Joe," Clyde said, pointing to the tall officer who stepped out first. Tommy and Clyde emerged from their cover, walking swiftly toward the lawman. Clyde introduced Tommy and pointed him toward his cousin, a serious man in his 40s wearing the uniform of a tribal investigator. What followed was tense. Father Milford appeared at the front door, eyes blazing, his expression a mix of outrage and disbelief. He looked exactly like the photo, older now, but unmistakable. He wore civilian clothes, but they were stained with something dark. "This is church property," the priest declared. "You have no right to be here. This woman is under our care. She's part of our faith community. She's receiving spiritual—" But his words fell flat under the weight of flashing lights and law enforcement uniforms. And for the first time in decades, Tommy felt the tide shift. Someone was finally listening. "Sir, we've received reports of assault and potential abduction involving tribal citizens," Officer Joe said, his voice calm but firm. "We're obligated to speak with this woman and inspect the premises." Within minutes, local police from Santa Rosa arrived, drawn in by the presence of Navajo Nation officers. The sheriff who had earlier dismissed Tommy looked visibly shaken now, caught in the center of a jurisdictional standoff involving the town's most revered figure. Father Milford continued to argue, insisting they were violating sacred space. He claimed the chamber was nothing more than a wine cellar, used for communion storage and private reflection. But that defense quickly collapsed. The tribal officers gently helped the injured woman from the car, and the truth became undeniable. She could barely stand. Her clothes were torn, blood marked her face, and bruises darkened her arms. Tommy stepped closer, his heart racing as he looked at her more closely. There, the scar, that same mark on her left temple, her eyes, the curve of her mouth. Even after all these years, through pain and time, he knew. "Eli," he called softly, using her Navajo name. "Naomi." Her head turned. Slowly, her eyes found him. And then, a gasp. For the first time in 40 years, she broke her vow of silence and spoke in broken Diné. "Brother, Ashki Yaji, Tommy." Everyone paused, stunned. The officers, the bystanders, even Father Milford stood frozen. Tommy stepped forward, tears filling his eyes. "This woman," he said, voice clear and strong, "is one of my sisters. She disappeared from St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school 40 years ago." Emergency medics were called in at once. As Naomi was examined with her consent, she spoke to them directly. "I am no longer part of that order. I release my vows. Do what you need to do." Her body bore the truth, fresh welts across her back, arms, and legs. The medical team quickly began treatment and IV hydration. Joe approached Tommy and Clyde near the ambulance. "We searched the underground room," he said, shaking his head. "It's disturbing. He made her drink communion wine, then beat her when she didn't respond the way he wanted." Naomi, hearing this, nodded weakly. "He believed the wine helped open our spirits," she said. "He thought it allowed us to receive divine messages. If we failed to deliver the answers he was looking for, we were punished." Joe added, "There's a large statue of the Virgin Mary down there, but right next to it, there's a table arranged with Navajo ceremonial items." He was blending faiths, twisting them. Naomi gave a bitter, weary smile. "We were forced to respond to people's prayer requests, the ones they submitted at church. He believed indigenous women were better at hearing divine voices, more in tune, he said. Clyde's face darkened. That's manipulation layered on abuse. Naomi's voice was steadier now. Only the indigenous women were punished. The white sisters were untouched. He gave us wine, told us to meditate, intoxicated, said it helped with visions. I refused to drink once, said I needed to be clear to speak to God. He beat me until I couldn't walk. Tommy took her hand, his grip shaking. Naomi, what about Sarah and Eva? Naomi hesitated. They're alive. They've learned how to survive by playing along. They've been faking visions for years, pretending to receive messages. It's easier to figure out what people want when you've read their prayers. Tommy felt the truth settle heavily on his shoulders. I think I saw them, at the compound, 2 women crying. I thought it was nothing. But now... Joe placed a firm hand on Tommy's shoulder. We've already contacted state officials. A full search of the monastery compound is underway. If your other sisters are there, we'll find them. You have my word. As Naomi was placed in the ambulance, Tommy climbed in beside her. Clyde followed in his truck as they made their way toward the regional medical center, sirens echoing through the canyon walls. The hospital waiting room was cold and sterile. Plastic chairs, buzzing lights, and the faint antiseptic scent that always lingered. Tommy sat beside Clyde, both men quiet, trying to absorb what had just unfolded. Naomi had been taken into emergency care the moment they arrived. The medical team worked quickly, tending to her injuries, flushing the alcohol from her system, and monitoring her vitals. Tommy stared at his hands. A life for a life, he said softly. I saved you once, and today, you helped save my sister. Clyde gave a quiet nod. That's how it's supposed to be. Navajo brothers, standing together. When it matters. And for the first time in 40 years, Tommy didn't feel alone in his search. Clyde leaned back in his chair, his voice low and thoughtful. He had settled in Albuquerque years ago with his wife and 2 kids, always wondering what became of the desperate man he once saved in the mountains, the man who spoke of missing sisters with unshakable determination. I never stopped looking, Tommy admitted. 40 years of false leads and empty hopes. I started to think maybe they were gone for good. I was just waiting to fade out in that old camper in Whispering Rock. Before Clyde could respond, a nurse approached with a clipboard. Are you here for the patient brought in from Shenandoah Rosa? Yes, Tommy said quickly, rising to his feet. How is she? She's stable, the nurse said with a professional calm. The alcohol has been cleared from her system. She's conscious, responsive, and aware of her surroundings. Some of her injuries required stitching, consistent with prolonged physical abuse. But she's strong. She's going to need time, but she's holding on. Just as Tommy was about to thank her, the sound of doors swinging open drew everyone's attention. Joe entered the hospital lobby, and behind him, walking slowly but unmistakably, were 2 women in black habits. Even after all these years, Tommy recognized them instantly. Sarah was the first to lock eyes with him. She froze mid-step, her hand rising to her mouth as tears spilled freely. Beside her, Ava looked puzzled, just for a moment, and then her face changed. Recognition washed over her like a wave. All 3 moved at once, drawn together as if pulled by invisible threads, decades of separation collapsing in a single, trembling moment. Nasli, Tommy whispered as he embraced Sarah. Ailen, he breathed as he held Ava close. Ashki Yaji, Sarah cried through her tears, calling him by his birth name. We never let ourselves hope. The years had left their mark. Tommy was 58, Sarah and Ava now well into their 50s. But in this moment, they were children again, siblings reunited at last. Tommy reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded a worn piece of paper, his most cherished sketch, drawn long ago under the cover of darkness. "Do you remember this?" he asked softly. The paper showed Naomi braiding Eva's hair with Sarah nearby, mid-song, a memory captured in graphite that time could not erase. The sisters gasped. "You drew this after evening prayers," Sarah recalled, her voice breaking. "When the lights were out, when no one was watching." "Where's Elise?" Ava asked, using Naomi's birth name. "Is she—" "She's safe," Tommy said gently. "She's being treated now. She's going to be okay." Joe approached, professionalism edged with emotion. "We'll need to take statements," he said. "The state police and federal agents are getting involved. What happened in 1945 wasn't just personal. It may have been criminal, across multiple levels. We need to hear your stories." They moved into a private consultation room where Joe set up a recording device. Tommy and Clyde went first, recounting everything from the church service to the horrific discovery at Father Milford's home. Then came Sarah and Ava. "What happened that day?" Joe asked softly. "The day you vanished in 1945? Sarah took a breath, steadying herself. "That morning, government officials and reporters came to St. Gertrude's. They wanted to see the success of the boarding school system. We were scrubbed clean and dressed up, some of the clothes donated by white church sponsors. They lined us up like display pieces," Ava added. "The youngest children, especially us, got the most attention. They said our wide eyes and innocence made for powerful images. We were photographed over and over." "Then the press left," Sarah continued, "and that's when Father Reginald Milford, the first Father Milford, approached us. He told us that God had chosen us, that we'd been selected by the Virgin Mary herself. He said we were to be her sacred daughters." Tommy's stomach turned. He could feel the truth unraveling, each word pulling more of the past into the light. "He promised we'd be protected," Eva said quietly. "Promised our prayers would be heard, that we'd be saved, but only if we took a vow of silence and never told a soul. The guardians knew," Sarah added bitterly. "They led us to him. Right after the cameras were gone, we were children. We obeyed." She looked down, voice trembling. "He took us through a hidden passage down into a basement chapel. We thought it was a prayer service." Joe's expression darkened as he reached over to stop the recording for a moment, giving them a break. They had just scratched the surface. "What happened next?" Joe asked gently. Sarah took a slow breath. "That very night, after the photographs were taken, Father Milford drove us out of town in an unmarked church vehicle. He brought us to a secluded compound outside what used to be called Cello Seco." She paused. "He left us there, with a cloistered order of Catholic nuns who answered to no one but their own leadership and private donors." Joe's expression darkened. "What was your treatment like at that place?" Ava answered, her voice flat, drained of emotion. "We were trained in a life of strict Catholic discipline. No speaking, long hours of prayer. If we made even small mistakes, we were forced to strip in front of Father Milford. He'd call us sinful, say we needed to be cleansed." She looked away. "He did it himself, said it was like Christ's suffering." Sarah picked up the thread. "In those early years, the punishments were daily. He called them corrections. As we grew older, we learned to stay out of his way. But that didn't mean we were safe." Eva's voice hardened. "He changed how he used us. We were made to handle prayer requests, from people, from corporations, even political figures. They paid for spiritual guidance. We had to drink wine, perform twisted versions of Navajo ceremonies, then write down so-called divine responses." Joe looked up sharply. "So this became profitable?" Eva nodded. "Yes. Mixing our traditions with Catholic symbols made it seem exotic, powerful. Donors believed it gave their prayers more strength. They gave generously." Tommy had been listening in stunned silence. Then the question burst out of him. "But why didn't anyone ever come looking? I searched for 40 years, Joe responded solemnly, because back in 1945, indigenous children didn't matter to the system. Racism was embedded in the law. Local officials didn't care. Boarding schools moved kids constantly, and no one questioned it. There were no alerts, no investigations. He continued. Their records were falsified. The school claimed your sisters were returned to family, that they'd been placed with a Christian household. With your mother gone and your father in prison, there was no one to challenge that lie. Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out the fragile newspaper clipping he had carried for decades. I always thought it was some stranger, a journalist, a school official, someone who saw the photo. I never once thought it could be the priest in the background. At that moment, a nurse appeared in the doorway. The patient in room 12 is asking for her family, she said kindly. She's ready for visitors. They found Naomi sitting up in bed, her eyes tired but aware. Her wounds had been cleaned and wrapped. The IV line in her arm delivered quiet strength. When she saw her brother and sisters standing together, her expression crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes. I never thought this day would come, she whispered. Tommy stepped forward and took her hand. We were so close at the church this morning, he said. You were right there. I just didn't know. Naomi squeezed his fingers. Maybe it wasn't time then. Maybe now it is. Whether it was the Catholic God or the spirits of our ancestors, something brought us back together. You did get your prayer answered, Tommy. Just not on paper. In life. Eva sat nearby, quiet in reflection. I still believe in the teachings, she said softly. But those people, Father Milford and the ones who followed him, they twisted everything. They used faith as a mask for control. Tommy nodded. When you're all ready, maybe we can rediscover what faith is really meant to be, in a way that lets us stay true to who we are, as Navajo, as family. There, in that hospital room, the four siblings sat close, the air thick with memory, but also with something else, something none of them had felt in decades: hope. Tommy closed his eyes briefly, feeling it settle in his chest like warmth. After 40 years of silence, separation, and searching, his prayer had been answered, not through words scrawled on paper, but through the return of what mattered most: family, and the quiet beginning of healing.